Welcome to Beyond Borders, the Immigration Evaluation Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mariella Shibley, and this is where we simplify the process of immigration evaluations into clear, actionable steps. If you're a psychologist, therapist, or social worker wanting to add this life-changing service to your practice, hit that follow button and let's jump in. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is one that I've been especially looking forward to. My guest is Dr. Andrew Rasmussen, a clinical psychologist, trauma researcher, and one of the very few people that's actively working to bring empirical structure to psychological evaluations in immigration proceedings. So if you've ever wondered what actually makes a good psychological evaluation, what makes it effective, and what makes it credible in court, or how attorneys and mental health professionals can better collaborate, then you're going to love this conversation. Dr. Rasmussen shares the origin story of his work in immigration and trauma, his current research gathering data from hundreds of attorneys and DOJ representatives, and how he's building what could become the first ever formal guidelines for psychologists or mental health professionals conducting evaluations in immigration law settings. We talk about common pitfalls that evaluators fall into, how to maintain objectivity while doing deeply human work, and why diagnosis alone is never enough. We also touch on the real-world pressures that evaluators and attorneys face and how we might move toward more meaningful, trauma-informed, and court-relevant evaluations. So let's get into it. Dr. Rasmussen, welcome to the show. As I mentioned, I heard you on this other podcast, and I'm just really excited to have you with me today. So to start us off, could you share a little bit about how your background, what drew you into the intersection between psychology and immigration law?
I started out it really started with graduate school. In graduate school, I was very interested in delinquency and juvenile delinquency. And this was when I was at Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And within it, as part of the work I did with juvenile delinquents, I would write reports for what was, I believe, called family court or juvenile court, that version of a legal setting that changes names from state to state, but essentially about working with kids who have committed crimes. And in Urbana, Illinois, there were a bunch of kids from Laos, from Laotian families, who were getting into some real trouble. And so from there, I sort of connected with the Refugee Services Center in the small town, which was connected, part of the refugee center within Urbana, Illinois. And so I got into the intersection of immigration and refugee and asylum, health. And then I already had done some forensic stuff. And so that when I came back from Illinois to my hometown, New York, to get a job, I found some work at a little clinic at Bellevue Hospital, which is a public hospital in New York City. And for 8 years, I worked as the research director in a program called the Program for Survivors of Torture. It's still there. The Bellevue Program for Survivors of Torture. It really focuses on the mental health and some physical health needs of people who are seeking asylum. Most of them are asylum seekers. And so that sort of got me started on that stuff. When I left Bellevue and went to Fordham as a faculty, got hired as faculty, I kept a connection to that world. My research area is trauma, so it all sort of fits in there. And that's sort of the last 20 years of my life right there. So a lot of these issues I've been thinking about.
So you were doing immigration evaluations
That's right.
in these settings.
That's
okay.
right.
Okay.
That's right. I was doing immigration. That was sort of the practice side of what I was doing. So,
and how did you? So, I guess you explained that because of your background, you kind of had some background on how to do. So you didn't get any specific training on how to do these evaluations. Did you struggle with that, the absence of actual guidelines or training?
Yeah, sure. There really wasn't much that I was aware of 20 years ago.
Right.
And, I was sort of putting it together by talking to colleagues and talking to immigration advocates, even talking to some government prosecutors or EOIR, adjudicators. That sort of helped me think about this stuff. But really, it
Sure.
was kind of, working with lawyers on these things, I think, is how many people who do these evaluations learn about them.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And so now more recently, you've taken on this really ambitious project, right? Which is creating the first ever formal guidelines for mental health professionals working in immigration proceedings. So, what inspired that
Yeah.
initiative? Was there a particular case or a moment that made you think, well, we need a roadmap?
Well, first of all, I think there are a few roadmaps out there. So it's not like there aren't guidelines. They're in the type of documents, books that you can read about these things, right? But what I noted after looking through various versions of book, mostly books, sometimes book chapters, outlined what these evaluations were and how they were put together. One thing I noticed is that there just wasn't any research on them. So usually it was, books written by a couple psychologists and a lawyer, or a psychiatrist and a lawyer, or sometimes just one person that were very thorough in that they covered a lot of areas, but rarely was there anything that, said in this study we found that, or in that study we found that, just because it hasn't been studied.
That's right. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
looked all over for this stuff. I really did. I worked. There was one of my colleagues is a well-known forensic psychologist who's done a lot of stuff in criminal work. He's done a little bit of stuff in immigration court, Barry Rosenfeld. And so when I was first looking at this stuff, I was like, Barry, is there really nothing out there? And he said, there's really nothing out there. I could find two studies, two qualitative studies where they actually asked people in immigration court, how do you use these assessments? What's valuable in these things and what's not valuable in these things? Uh,
Hmm.
One was actually asking immigration attorneys and one DOJ representative. Another one was asking a sort of multidisciplinary group. There was a psychologist, a social worker, a former judge, and then some psychology and some other people who worked in forensic mental health. But they're two small studies. They really just asked what's helpful about these things, and they weren't really focused only on psychological evals
That's right.
or medical
Medical.
legal affidavits. You know what I'm talking about,
Correct.
sort of like
Hmm.
with medical
Hmm.
inspections. And there you get those are really important, but as you probably know, they're few and far between in this world, right?
And there's a particular article that's often sort of, I don't know if it's miscited, but it's a little misguided. Let's just
Uh-huh.
say that it was the study of the Board of Immigration Appeals, where they came up with statistics of how helpful forensic evaluations are, but they oftentimes the mental health professionals fail to mention that really it's mostly directed at the medical affidavit, not really psychological.
Yep. And
Yeah,
don't get me wrong, medical affidavits are great, but
of course.
but that's not what we're dealing with usually.
Right.
Very few people have scars that are clearly scars made by, I don't know, cigarette burns in detention or something like that. So,
Hmm.
dealing with psychological scars, which are a very different.
Oftentimes invisible.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, you can't see them, see 'em in
Exactly.
observation.
Exactly.
So all that is to say that a few years ago, 2023, myself and somebody who had a similar trajectory to me, a woman named Adiyinka Akinsaluri Smith, who's now a faculty member at City College, New York. She had worked at the Bellevue program. She was my colleague there for a long time. We were sort of sitting around and we said, okay, how would we start developing a set of empirically informed guidelines? And she had, by the way, she has a book on practice that's practice based that's quite good with another psychologist and a lawyer. But she said, well, okay, let's, maybe we can ask attorneys and DOJ reps what they think as a way to start. So,
Right. Right. And
yeah,
yeah, and that's one thing that stands out about your approach is that you're gathering direct input from immigration attorneys, which is brilliant. It's honestly something that I wish more researchers would do.
yeah,
And so what kind of feedback have you received so far that sort of challenged or even surprised your assumptions going into this project?
yeah. Well, if I can, let me tell you a little bit about the project as the design, and then I'll tell you about the feedback.
Yes, of
So
course.
we conceptualized this as sort of a three-phased project. The first two are data collection, and the third is kind of a reviewing the findings and seeing how they might be built into guidelines. So it's a long-term project. So back in 2023, we started by just talking to experienced attorneys that we knew. And, we reached out from them and did some snowball sampling and got some other experienced attorneys. But when I say experienced, people who had been in the field for a while, 5, 10, we had some 20-year veterans there, and people who had requested mental health evals to support their clients' claims. And we ended up talking to 20 of them. We got a lot of interesting information. I've actually just been delving into that qualitative work. And the idea there was to sort of set the agenda as, get some in qualitative work. You can get deep into relationships between themes. The limitations of qualitative work, as you may know, is that you're just defining experiences. You can get really nice, thick descriptions of all these things, but you can't tell how often they occur, what the percentage of attorneys think about this or that. But you do get a really good description of the types of opinions out there.
Sure.
We found a lot of consistency over the people we talked to. So we thought that even though we only talked to 20 attorneys and DOJ reps, that we were getting we have a pretty good idea of what the agenda might be, even though we don't have percentages of different opinions. But then we took the qualitative findings and developed questions for a questionnaire. And that's where we are right now. So that's why I'm going on podcasts and showing up at the American Immigration Lawyers Association meeting. And it was a lot of fun out in Denver and trying to get people on through LinkedIn and all this stuff. And so far, we've gotten responses on a pretty lengthy survey from about 220. No, sorry, I think we're up to 240 attorneys and DOJ reps, which we're pretty happy
Great.
about. And
Yeah.
nationwide. We still would like more people from the southern United States, but we have a lot of people. Of course, we have a lot of people from the Northeast. We got a bunch of people from California. You'd be happy about that. A few people up in the Northwest and the Midwest has been responsive. We'd still love to get more people from Texas and Florida. So if any of your listeners know attorneys in Texas and Florida, please tell them about this. And we have, presence on LinkedIn. It's not my page. We actually created an account for this project called Psychological Evaluations in Immigration Proceedings. And we've been doing email recruitment through all sorts of advocacy websites and all that. So any questions about that?
Yeah. So I guess I'd love to hear more about the actual framework that you're building. Like, what are some of the core principles or components that you hope will be included in this guidelines? Are there elements that perhaps you've adapted from other areas of forensic psychology, or are you starting sort of completely from scratch?
For the research, we're really asking attorneys what's helpful and what's not helpful in these reports. And we don't mean just in the reports. We mean the reports, the content of the reports, but also the processes that we go through. So in the qualitative work, we heard a lot about the referral question. What happens when the attorneys send out a referral to you saying, I have this client, they're claiming relief under the Violence Against Women's Act, say, or under Convention Against Torture, or they're an asylum seeker. And I think they have this, but I want you to talk to them, and love to know more about them. Or what happens in a not uncommon release, I'm not really sure what's going on, but it seems like something's happening here. So how the referral question gets made is important. And
Yeah, which is that is the one thing that we struggle a lot with. In my experience, a lot of course, like new attorneys to me,
Yes.
the ones that work with me, it's a different story,
Yep.
but newer attorneys will send me a brief summary of the person's case. And
Yeah.
it's like, no, I'm pretty good at gathering the history. I
Yeah.
just want you to tell me what your concerns are, what question you wish my report will answer.
That's right. And the experienced attorneys that we talked to in the qualitative study, many of them said, when I started out, I'd say, my supervisor would say, oh, you need a psychological evaluation. So I'd say, okay. And I call the psychologist, I need a psychological evaluation. And he's like,
Boom, that's it.
And a lot of clinical psychologists will give you a psychological evaluation, but it's not going to be appropriate for
That's right.
immigration court because it's not speaking to the specific issues. And
Exactly.
so there was a bunch of discussion of the complexity of how these reports do two things. One, their reports are asked to provide another source of information on the actual narrative of the client, right? What happened to the client? Why are they seeking this particular type of deportation relief, right? If it's an asylum seeker, what happened to them in their home country? Um, Maybe a little bit about migration, their migration narrative, although and here's where it gets tricky is there's a tension between providing enough detail to get to a diagnosis and support the claim and providing too much detail that can then trip up the client on at testimony. And that's a real tension there, and not one
True.
that psychologists think about. I
Hmm.
think it's most psychologists.
Hmm.
Because as psychologists, we want to know a sort of psychosocial history, which is, essentially what a narrative is in the report here, psychosocial history, in order to make the diagnosis.
That's right.
And
Right.
attorneys want to make the diagnosis to support the veracity of the narrative. So there's two different directions, right? We're going one way, they're going the other way. And when you have that, you can get into all sorts of complicated stuff.
Hmm. Yeah, you open it up to, I always say like a report should always answer questions, not elicit more questions. And when you're writing for the reader,
Yes.
when you're keeping in mind who the reader is and how they're likely to interpret certain things, then you're more mindful of what you're including and not including in the report to make sure that it doesn't create confusion, misunderstandings. It opens up cans of worms,
Yeah.
that go in different directions, unknowingly, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, most mental health professionals are doing it with the best interest in mind,
That's right.
they're so,
That's right. I really
yeah,
like that writing for the reader. I mean, writing for the reader is something I try and tell my students all the time. But I think here the dilemma comes when we don't know, when the psychologist really doesn't know the dynamics that go into who the readers are.
that's right. And the common pitfalls, and which I want to talk about
Mhm.
too as well. But, it seems like your work could really help bridge a gap between clinicians and attorneys. So, in your view, what role can attorneys play in shaping or, you know, enforcing perhaps these guidelines? And, or in other words, what's one thing that you wish more attorneys understood about our work as mental health evaluators?
Well, I'm not sure if it's reasonable, but it would be great to have attorneys have some sort of, standard handout describing what these type of forensic assessments are about. There is the standard suggestion that psychologists who do these things get training in forensic mental health and in immigration law as well. I think that would be great, but I'm not sure it's feasible given the need and given that a lot of mental health professionals seem to do this on a real part-time basis, right? There are some people who I, this is my, outside of the university, this is my private practice and I've been doing it for 20. I know it, I get it, but most people who do these evals are doing them on, a few here, a few there, maybe on a pro bono basis. And so they don't have, if they're going to go get continuing ed credits, they might go to a training course like yours, which I think is fantastic to go to those things, but there's just a greater demand. So maybe if attorneys had a handout saying, look, these evals are not the type of standard clinical evals you do when somebody comes into your office and you're trying to figure out what's the best course of action to get them well again, or to define their problems in a way that a therapist can work on them. Although that might be helpful in some ways, there's a lot of stuff that's going to be distracting from the point of the legal claim.
Right. Right.
So but of course, that presupposes that attorneys can understand what psych evals, standard psych evals often are. So again, I'm not sure if that's reasonable. One of the considerations that we've sort of batted around is trying to develop a little fact sheet for attorneys to get out to attorneys and say, look, this is what psych evals usually are, but they differ from the things you're asking for. based on this, this, this. And it's not unreasonable to ask mental health professionals to make sure they link the clinical observations to the particular points of the claims that you are arguing for your clients. Or it's not unreasonable to say, we don't need all that detail about how you got from, I don't know, Honduras to Chicago or something like that.
Hmm. Yeah, I think oftentimes the overemphasis on details, unnecessary details, and the belief that a longer report is a better
Yes.
report is what oftentimes, gets people into hot water.
Yeah.
So along those lines, I guess, many of my listeners are either conducting evaluations or training to do so. And we all want to always get better at it,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
There's always room for improvement. So what are some common pitfalls that you see in evaluation reports submitted to immigration court? If you've heard about this from attorneys, what should evaluators be watching out for
Yeah.
in addition to these things that we were talking about?
So one is the details. You need the details to make your diagnosis, and that's important. You want to balance that with the details that are critical to the claim that is being made. Along those lines, there is another one. It's not necessarily related, but there's a tendency, I've noticed in discussion around these types of vows, there is a real emphasis and sort of almost a preference for diagnosing people with post-traumatic stress disorder. And PTSD has a lot of, it makes perfect sense that this would be a population that has higher rates of PTSD than the average person in the US or the average person even in the home country, right? Makes sense. They're fleeing from a trauma event, likely, and so they may have PTSD. It doesn't make sense that all of them have PTSD. And that
Hmm. Hmm.
is something that has come up in our research where attorneys have said, yeah, judges and government attorneys, some of them roll their eyes at, okay, yeah, they got PTSD. So try not to succumb to that pressure to sort of give the client PTSD because one, it's unethical, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
You're using information that's not clinical to create clinical information, really, right? Which is not what we should be doing. And two, to recognize that there are other problems, psychological problems that are associated with trauma events. And even if somebody doesn't have a diagnosable condition, we should be happy about that for them. But
Right.
there are symptoms that people may be displaying that don't present in a pattern that means they have a diagnosis or some sort of psychopathology, but they still may be very helpful for
Absolutely.
justifying the claim.
Right. And it's not just symptoms, it's just personality characteristics, it's
Yep,
life changes,
that,
right? Things that they used to not do and now they do, or
that's
things
right.
that they used to do and now they don't do. It's like that before and after impact that can actually I think a lot of times that holds a lot more weight
That's right.
than just a diagnosis by itself that could potentially be treated, right?
Diagnoses
These
by
life
themselves are not very helpful, in fact, just by
No,
themselves. You have to
that's
really
right.
connect the elements of the symptoms, what the diagnosis means, maybe associated features like, even in post-traumatic stress disorder. I had an attorney tell me, I had a report where somebody just said, this person has PTSD, you should give them asylum. First of all, you don't want to say you should give them asylum. You're going to step on the judge's toes. That's a legal thing, and you'll make the judge mad. But
Mhm.
But also, just saying PTSD doesn't connect it back to the particular claim, doesn't connect it to the particular event they're talking about, and doesn't do what so many attorneys want PTSD to do, which is to describe the memory problems that are
Right.
associated with experiencing severe trauma.
Right, and I think that's a common issue with specifically asylum evaluations or anything like CAT or
Mhm.
which is what it is that they want the mental health professional to evaluate. Is it the impact of the persecution that they suffered, how much they suffered, if to substantiate that, Or is it issues around credibility? Or is it because they didn't apply within 1 year of arriving in the country? I mean, asylum is the one case that it could go in so many different
Yep.
directions. And it's so important to know what the referral question is, because you might just be overly focused on a diagnosis with a person who's, I haven't met a person really whose trauma was just so specific to one incident,
That's
right?
right.
Especially those who are seeking asylum.
That's true.
They, they oftentimes have multiple
Nice.
traumas. And so, an adjudicator will say, okay, so he has PTSD, but based on what
That's
event?
right.
You mentioned 10, and the only one we're concerned with here is the persecution.
That's right.
So, mm-hmm,
That's exactly right. And that's something that we're not usually trained to do.
mm-hmm,
And so that said, we are trained to evaluate more than PTSD.
right.
And frankly, a good clinical psychologist or LCSW or, PsyD or whoever it is going to be trained to evaluate aspects of a person's psychology that are not pathological.
That's right.
And those can be helpful too. We know about memory, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
We know that memory is not a carbon copy of the event that we're remembering, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's not something that judges and certainly not government prosecutors know. And if there's any slight deviation from the relating that event, they're going to say, oh, they're inconsistent. That shows they're lying. When in fact,
Right.
it's very consistent to be
That's right.
somewhat inconsistent.
That's right. Absolutely. And, another thing is that there's always this delicate balance between being clinically neutral and advocating for a client's story. And sometimes attorneys want us to lean more into advocacy more than we're comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
So what advice do you have for evaluators trying to maintain that objectivity, especially when they're dealing with, some very compelling and heartbreaking cases sometimes?
Yeah. And it's a debate among psychologists who do this. I have a grad student, a great new grad student, Natalia Vallejo Ulloa, who's looking at these issues in her own research. And she went just sort of as an observer to a training through there's a National Association for Latino Psychiatrists.
Oh, the one a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, you know it. Okay. Were you there?
I heard of it. No, I was not there.
But
I don't know anything about it, so tell me.
yeah, she
How'd it
went
go?
and she was just telling me yesterday. Yeah, it was really interesting. You said what it said it was going to be, which is the people talking about their own experience doing these evaluations. She said, but throughout all of the presentations, a tension came up between mental health practitioners who were saying we need to be an advocate. We need to advocate for these clients, and others that said, well, we are called on as experts, and so we need to present information as experts and not be overtly advocates. This gets to some of the tension between just the way that experts are used in the law in general, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The defense gets to hire an expert in criminal court, and the prosecutors get to bring in their expert, right? In civil
That's
courts,
right.
the plaintiffs get to have their experts, and the person who's getting sued or whatever gets to have their experts. In immigration court, I've never been called by the prosecution side. I don't know that.
Never.
I've never heard.
Never.
You've never.
I wish I were.
It would be
But
interesting.
no.
It would be interesting.
Yeah.
And it would be nice to sort of have
Absolutely.
that, because then you can say, well, actually, I've been called by both. But I don't think that ICE attorneys actually call experts.
No. At least not as of now.
That's right. Yeah. Who knows? Could be different next week, like everything else in
Exactly.
immigration court these days. But we are hired, or at least contracted by the immigration advocates, right? And so it can certainly presents a quandary sometimes, right? This gets a little bit at something that came up in every conversation and still comes up in every conversation I have with attorneys, even the ones that I work with regularly, which is, you have this report. What do they get to say if they don't like some piece of information? How do we do this? Is this information that could be worded differently? Well, I don't know. how important is this piece of, diagnostic information to your diagnosis here? And if it represents something that they're worried will be a problem. So I take, and a number of attorneys actually agree, take the position that we're experts. If you present something to me that, I got a fact wrong about like when they cross the border or, you know, that sort of thing, okay, that's on me. I want to correct.
Yeah.
But if the person who's coming to me seems to be um, smoking marijuana 3 times a day, and it might be some sort of coping mechanism as to the way that, as the things that happen to them, or in their involvement in the process of seeking asylum, they just can't handle the stress. This is the coping mechanism. I can't really delete that.
Right, but and that's something that I talk about often. It's how you include it.
That's exactly
Actually, by the time this episode comes out, my previous episode is exactly on that, on
oh,
how do we prevent
that's
undesirable information, right? So you could absolutely
bad
say that they
practice.
engage in maladaptive coping
Exactly.
mechanisms,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
As opposed to specifically saying that they
That's
use, a drug that's federally unlawful.
that's right. If that's justified, then do what's justified. I mean, and
Right.
if that's a part of your diagnosis, put it in there. And if an attorney says, "Wow,"
Mhm,
and
mhm,
the judge
mhm.
has to like my client, I would say, look, I'm not sure the judge actually has to like your client. Maybe because it's discretionary, but the judge has to understand the issues that your client is going through related to the basis of the claim.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. So now looking ahead, once
Mm.
these guidelines are finalized and available, what impact do you hope that they'll have? What could change for evaluators, for attorneys, and of course the people that we serve?
Yeah. Well, um, my hope is that it provides more clarity between attorneys and the mental health professionals who make these reports, just in terms of what should be focused on and really what's relevant. I don't think, I'm not, again, I think I just implied, I'm not of the position that we need to give the lawyers everything they want, right?
That's
Um,
right.
because we're experts. We're supposed to inform the court as to the best, as to what's going on with the client. Um,
Hmm.
I think that a set of guidelines for attorneys dealing with mental health professionals is great. I hope to be able to, provide some empirically based information for training sessions like the ones you do. Say, and it might be something like, we've been saying for years to do X, and look, there's some evidence to show that attorneys appreciate it when you do that. uh,
That's right.
um, when I think about impact on the larger system, when we started this out in 2023, I would have said, okay, I think we can have some impact in sort of increasing the level of professionalism within the system. And because right now I think it's primarily dominated by the advocacy viewpoint, which, while I'm sympathetic to, it creates a problem when you're dealing with expert with trying to stay in that expert role when there's so much pressure to be an advocate. Thinking about it in 2025, I mean, you know, immigration proceedings are in such flux, right? I mean, I don't know how much, I imagine you're tracking this, but I don't know how many immigration judges have either been just fired or
Oh yeah.
taken voluntary leave recently. And the plan is to replace them with military lawyers, not even
That's right.
adjudicators, and who are going to come in on these 6-month contracts. And my little knowledge of military lawyers is they're really good at following instructions, because the military is really good at, like, you have a procedure, they are going to follow it. But doing anything on 6-month contracts there's going to be a lack of experience that's just going to be sort of baked in to immigration proceedings. So I think that my imagined impact for what any sort of guidelines can do has shrunken a little bit in the last few months.
Yeah, because I guess these guidelines would be both for the law professionals and mental health professionals, right? Or were you gearing them more towards one or the other?
Well, initially I thought of them as more of these are guidelines that will be informative for mental health professionals. I think that they're helpful for law professionals in that they can educate, particularly the new attorneys, of which there are lots of them because a lot of them burn out, by the way,
Oh,
which
yeah.
is another, just an aside. In our survey that we're getting, and even in the qualitative piece, we asked about trauma-informed practice in lawyering, and we asked about what about trauma-informed practice for you and your organization. And so we've got a whole piece on burnout and vicarious trauma and just what's the right term? Compassion fatigue, right? So, we hope to develop something out of that as well. But in terms of the focus on the assessments, I think it's useful, particularly for new attorneys, to have something more concrete than I need a psych eval. I think maybe saying, hey, I need a psych eval, Dr. So and so. I don't know how many of these you've done, but I've got a brief handout or a brief, summary of the types of things that are useful in these things. I wonder if you don't mind looking at it.
Right, right. And for them to, I remember back in 2013 when the provisional waiver came out,
Mhm.
everybody was sending everybody. All attorneys were sending everybody. And sometimes, it was, especially back then, there were a little bit more restrictions. The original sort of standards were a little more restrictive. And so it actually prompted me to come up with a screening questionnaire for attorneys to give to
That's
their
a great
clients
that's a great idea.
to see if they would benefit from a psychological evaluation. So it was very general in the sense that it didn't ask for a lot of detail. But say, for example, something happened to me a while back that is still upsetting me, or something along those lines, right? And so if they checked, a certain number of boxes, then it was like, okay, send them to us. It's very likely that we can do something with this, right? That we can move on with an
Yep.
evaluation, because some of them were just like, well, I own a house in Mexico, we're there all the time, back and forth. It's not a
Yeah,
big deal. And I'm
yeah,
like, why did they send you to us?
yeah. I had a
Right?
client referred for an eval recently who asked him, so, I couldn't really figure out what the claim was, and ultimately the attorney clarified it was a competency claim. But the sort of basis of any further claim at past competency was like, well, I'm building a house for my mom
That's right.
in Guatemala. I was like, great, man,
Yeah.
but I don't think your time is well spent sitting on the other side of this table because
Exactly.
not a
Yeah.
great case.
And and we have referral forms that we hope our attorneys will fill out, and unfortunately a lot of them don't. And I don't blame them. They're
Yeah,
they're
sure did.
super busy, but it would just make life so much easier for everybody involved, because we've now become, and that's also one of the reasons why I think education training in this type of work is so important, because the legal foundation is, you have to have some basis of understanding of the case that you're
Yep,
working on,
yep,
because then you don't know to what to hone in on, or what to not waste your time
that's right.
discussing, and anything that would make that process more straightforward, more streamlined. I think it would be helpful to everybody involved. And for all we know, like, maybe there will be a time when immigration court will expect a certain standard
Yeah,
of psychological evaluation, or
at
yeah.
least in New York, there are already indications that has been an evolution in what judges expect these days. A lot of judges are expecting malingering tests or some sort of test of effort,
Yeah.
right? Uh,
Mhm.
okay, give them a Tom, or if you want an SRS, something more involved. But so, I mean, and a couple of attorneys talked about sort of well, when the judges get their idea that they see something, they said, oh, that's really helpful. And then they want it from everybody, and then they want more.
That's right.
So there's sort of right, a
Yeah.
arms race here. But there are things I think that we can include that are not particularly burdensome, that do increase the sort of rigor of our evaluations. Can I
Mhm.
want to say something about what you were just talking about in terms of legal training. If you look in the practice-based literature, which there's a lot more than the empirical-based literature, the books and book chapters and that sort of thing, a lot, almost the first recommendation is that mental health professionals get training in immigration law. And I agree with you that knowing about the immigration claim that you're writing the report about is important. What I fear is that it turns off a lot of people like, oh, I'd really like to do something in this area. I find it really interesting and I feel I have something to contribute and I could inform immigration court. But I'm not a lawyer. I don't know anything about immigration law. And it's confusing. What's the difference between asylum and CAT? I don't know. But I think that, and in our interviews with experienced lawyers, a few of them said, you know what? You don't really have to know much about immigration law. In fact, one of them said, it's kind of helpful if you don't know that much and you just say, look, I don't know what's going on over there between your legal stuff, but in my expertise over here, because that's really what you're being contracted to do. You're being contracted to be an expert in mental health, not in immigration law.
That's right.
The other danger for being an expert in immigration law is that you start talking in legal terms. And as we said before, judges don't like that.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely. I mean, immigration law is, I believe I've heard it's the second most complex law in the country after tax law,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's impossible
Oh, yeah.
for us.
Oh.
I mean, we already did enough to become mental health professionals,
Yeah.
like to actually even learn about this.
That's right.
I think it's more important, not so much about the case and the logistics, but also to put the referral question in context.
That's right.
Right?
Yep.
And to know the nuances, to, for example, know what an RFE is, right? A request for more evidence, and learn from those.
That's right.
See what pitfalls are there that you could unknowingly fall into and very easily avoid.
Yep.
Minor things like, for example, the other day we had an attorney request. Somebody said, what was it? I think she said the father had 2 strokes. And the attorney said, no, it was just 1 stroke. And so remove the second one. And the clinician's like, okay, that's like such a minor detail. Like, why, be so, picky on it, right? And I'm thinking, okay, well, my guess is that they only have evidence for the 1 stroke, right? Medical evidence that they will submit. And the reader could easily misconstrue that and say, oh, she's exaggerating. She said he had 2, but he actually just had 1. What else did he exaggerate about?
Which is it, Dr. Shively? Is it 1 stroke or 2 strokes?
Or 2 strokes, right? So it's those little details.
Yes.
That a mental health professional would be like, well, I'm not changing it because she told me to.
Right.
But, okay, first of all, is it relevant to your conclusion, to your opinion, whether you had 1 or 2? Does it change anything? No. Okay. And could it actually, this create more problems? The other day we had, this was embarrassing, but we got an RFE from a report from years ago where somebody had a child with somebody, there were partners living together, but they never got married. And in one point, the evaluator mentioned in the report her ex-husband, referring to this person. She made a mistake. She called him an ex-husband instead of an ex-partner. That triggered an RFE because they're saying, well, you said you were only married once, but the report refers to an ex-husband. So now we need to see a copy of that marriage decree and that divorce decree. And it was awful, right? So such a minor detail that us as mental health professionals, we never thought that would be a big deal.
Right.
And understanding how their minds work, what they're looking for, is what's most important. It goes way beyond just how to diagnose and how to, connect 2 dots.
That's right. You do need to have, or at least be open to hearing. I often say at Fordham, we have a forensic mental health service at our community clinic attached to the university. And to my trainees, I often say, look, if you don't know something, if you get feedback from a lawyer and it's sort of legal feedback, that's something you don't know. So, and they do know. That's what they've trained in, just like you've been trained in clinical psych. So you can defer to them on that. If they want to change the clinical information, that's something you know better than
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Those details.
Gosh, I feel like we could keep talking for
Yeah.
hours
Yep.
on this. It's always nice for me to come across somebody, who kind of has a lot of experience in this, and
Yeah.
we can compare notes
Definitely.
and
For me
and
too. It's been a
collaborate,
pleasure.
which is
And
yeah,
at the end of our survey that we're doing, we'll probably have some analyses, probably by the spring sometime. So, if you want, I'd love to come back and talk about the results. Sure.
absolutely. I would love that, and I know that, I mean, this conversation is really gonna resonate with my listeners. I hope that even, it sparks even more collaboration between evaluators and attorneys. If people wanna sort of follow your work, or is there a place where we can just kinda keep up with what's going on?
Uh,
Or
yeah, we do have a connected to a website, and it's really just a description of the project, and we'll be posting updates there. We also keep our LinkedIn page open and do posts there. Feel
yeah, if you can send me your LinkedIn
I'll do that.
page, then I'll include it in the show notes. I just gave a talk at the ALA chapter, the San Diego
Um,
chapter.
I find it fascinating, and from just to see how lawyers think about stuff, and going to the conference was a real eye opener for me of what's going on, and so.
Yeah, did you get to attend any of the talks?
No, I was in because we were
Just the
recruiting,
exhibitors?
I was in the exhibitor hall, so I got in there with first of all, there's probably another podcast to be done about the various firms that have sprung up to do evaluation, psych evals.
Oh,
Uh,
I know.
yeah, really interesting stuff. I went around and I hired a couple of folks from the University of Denver who were nearby, some students to go recruit, and they were handing out flyers. So I'd take a walk around and talk to people, and some of them were like, okay, this is obviously an interesting, somebody's really thought about these things. And others was like, yep, we can get you an eval in 2 weeks for $900 and a week for $1,200. And if you want in 24 hours, we can do that too. We'll have to negotiate the price. I'm like, great. That sounds super.
Or, well, our evaluations are 20 pages long, and it includes country conditions and references.
Great. The judge is gonna have a lot of time to read that. I even
Right.
had some of the most interesting things that happened to me, and I wish I'd followed up with them to get them to talk more about this. But when we were recruiting, I had a couple of attorneys there, more than a couple, say to me, well, I don't really refer to people to those evals anymore. I was like, well, I want you to take this survey then. Definitely, please take the survey.
Absolutely, right.
And then I'd say, and tell me why you should do that. And they said, because I get this eval that's either too long or too short, and it basically says they have PTSD. It doesn't do anything for the claim, and then I've just wasted my client's money. And I was like, that sounds like pretty good reasons not to refer. But it really speaks to the variability in quality of these things that
That's
we.
right, that's right. Which is why, again, why these guidelines?
That's why you
Yes,
need.
why we do
That's why you
training
need a.
and why we need okay, yes, yes, and the guidelines, and
Yeah.
some guidelines so that we're all on the same page, not just mental health professionals, but law professionals as well. How, like, just one diagnosis doesn't, will not, oftentimes is not the end all and be all, right?
Yep.
Especially in cases where perhaps, like a U visa, where the crime occurred many years ago. Thank goodness they no longer meet criteria for a diagnosis.
That's
That
right.
still, it could still be an excellent report, because what you need to show is how it impacted them, how it harmed them
Yes.
at the time. So passing of time, it's not a big deal. Well, anyway, it's been a real pleasure talking with you,
Mine too.
and we'll absolutely have you back.
Great.
Yeah, this
Keep you on my short list for getting out the results and our discussion of this, and maybe even get your feedback on some of the findings to help develop the guidelines. I think that'd be really helpful.
sure.
Okay.
Absolutely. Okay.
Thanks so much.
Well, that's it for today's episode. What an insightful conversation with Dr. Andrew Rasmussen. I hope that you found it as thought-provoking and affirming as I did. I'm so grateful for the work that he's doing to create a more ethical, effective, and credible standard for immigration evaluations. His project is one that has the potential to elevate our entire field and, more importantly, ensure fair outcomes for the immigrants and the families that we serve. If you'd like to follow Dr. Rasmussen's work or get involved with the Guidelines Project, be sure to check the show notes. I'm going to include links there. If you're an attorney listening and want to contribute to his ongoing research, be sure to check the show notes. I'll include the link to his survey, his LinkedIn project page, and some other resources that we discussed. And if you found this episode helpful, please consider sharing it with a colleague or leaving a review. It helps us reach more mental health professionals who are looking to grow in this work. So as always, thank you for listening, for showing up, and for doing the hard and meaningful work that you do. Until next time, take good care.